Media is powerful. It can change a culture. It can change a whole generation. It can impact the entire globe. 2 years ago, Shalom World TV was a dream. Today, it's a reality. A commercial-free, high-definition television network broadcasting from the United States of America, reaching 375 million English-speaking people around the globe. We want to reach to the ends of the earth. Throughout the year, Shalom missionaries work day and night to accomplish this mission, to produce programs that evangelize the culture.
What is wrong with contraception?
Tonight on Seekers.
I can make time for you.
For divine knowledge.
We want to continue this mission. We want to produce more programs to impact this generation positively. Will you be with us? Can you take a commitment of donating just $25 a month for the next 12 months? We assure you of our prayers. Visit shalomworld.org/donate today. We thank you for your generosity.
Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. We're here in the small daily chapel at St. Anne's Church in Barrington. And behind me is a stained glass window depicting Jesus as the Good Shepherd. Jesus said, "I am the Good Shepherd. I know mine and mine know me." As is so often depicted in the Good Shepherd paintings and statues, Jesus is holding a little lamb in his hand and in his arms, and then he's surrounded by other lambs. If we're going to follow Jesus, we have to be humble enough to allow our spirit to be formed and fashioned by Jesus' spirit. We have to allow the Good Shepherd to call us and to lead us. Now, when he leads us into bright sunshine pastures, that's easy. But sometimes where the Good Shepherd leads us is into places of suffering in our life, into places of vulnerability. And that's where poverty of spirit kicks in, where we have to be humble enough to acknowledge that God is God and we are not, that the Good Shepherd knows what we need, and that he's never going to lead us into harm. But there may be deep suffering in each of our lives. We have to embrace our vulnerability. As Roman Catholics, there are two images of Jesus that we especially gravitate toward. One of them is the child Jesus, and the other one is the crucified one. Behind me is a statue of St. Anthony, and in his arms, he's holding the child Jesus. Part of what's so powerful about the image of the child Jesus is it's an image of radical vulnerability. Think about it. If you drop a child, you could maim that child for life. And yet that's how Jesus enters into his world. This is how Jesus enters into our world, like us in all things but sin, coming into our world as a vulnerable little child. In this beautiful chapel, there's a stained glass window of Jesus crucified. Those two images share in common radical vulnerability. A naked man nailed to the cross is not going anywhere. A poor, vulnerable child is not going to be able to harm us. These two images of God help us to become poor in spirit, help us to become vulnerable, help us to allow ourselves to have Jesus pick us up and hold us close to his arms when deep suffering comes into our life, as inevitably it will. This side chapel is of special significance for the Sparrow family because it was here in this chapel that my mom's funeral mass was celebrated. I'll never forget standing in this chapel with my brother Jesuit priests concelebrating, and members of our family and members of the congregation at St. Anne's and other close friends as we gathered together to say goodbye to my mom. My mom is one of the heroes in my life, certainly along with my dad. But my mom taught me things that my dad could not teach me. If I have any speaking ability, I know that comes from my dad. He had the gift of gab. He was a very successful salesman. But my dad also drank too much. And when he drank, he got angry. And when he got angry, he became abusive, especially toward my mom. And that in turn made me so angry that here was my dad picking on my mom, and I knew it was very unfair. And then I got angry at him, and we were like two bulls clashing. Well, my dad got cancer, and he did not handle that cancer very well. He started to drink even more, and then he became more angry and more abusive. I'll never forget when I was arguing with my dad one time after he had been particularly abusive toward my mom. And then my mom called me aside later in private and she said, Michael, for all of your study, for all of your training in psychology and your training as a spiritual director and your book learning, don't you understand what's going on? Your father doesn't mean what he says. He's frightened. Everything that he's worked for is being stripped away. Can't you see that behind the mask of that anger is a frightened little child? We need to be patient. We need to be understanding as he faces his death. My mom was absolutely right. That was a turning point in my relationship with my dad as he drew near to death. I tried to be more patient and understanding from that point forward. That wasn't the only lesson that my mother had taught me. She had been a mentor. I work as a spiritual director, listening to many people's stories. And I learned that ability to be able to listen deeply to what people were saying and what they were not saying through my mother. Because my dad was a salesman and he was out there, and sometimes he was successful in his sales and sometimes he wasn't successful. And he would get beat up, metaphorically speaking, by going in and making his best sales pitch, and other people would say, sorry, we're not interested. That took his ego took a big beating. And so he'd come home every night and he'd talk to my mom, and my mom would listen patiently, and she'd be encouraging. She'd celebrate his victories, and then she would mourn the losses. But she was always there listening so patiently. When we were kids, I never forget that night after night, my mom would put us to bed with a story. And sometimes those stories were kind of scary, and sometimes those stories were exciting, and sometimes those stories were consoling. But I know the reason that I'm a storyteller today and my great love of drama comes from the fact that every night my mom put us to bed with a story, and then she led us in our prayers. My dad was active. He was a leader in the church. He was the head of the Holy Name Society. He was the head of the golf league. He was very active in the church and in civic affairs. My mom was much more patient. She was much more quiet. She didn't like to get out in front of the crowds. My dad always liked to get out in front of the camera. My mom, no, she was always in the background. And I'm a combination of both my mom and my dad. When my mom turned 80, I wrote a poem for her. And she loved that poem. And she said, Michael, that's a great poem. You should send that off to Hallmark and have them make that into a greeting card. Now, I don't know if it'll ever be made into a greeting card. But when my mom died, I rewrote that poem, and I recited that poem for those who were here at St. Anne's Chapel at part of her funeral mass. Here's the poem that I read in celebration of my mom's life. My mom, who had taught me so much about what it means to be poor in spirit. Because of the love of my mother, I believe in the gift of God's love, bounty of the Lord's faithful mercy. So I rise with the sun to praise God, to pray for myself and all others, because of the love of my mother. I relish the wonder of stories, magic in the kingdoms they conjure. Patiently, nightly she read, until we slept under the covers, because of the love of my mother. I treasure a tender side of love, quiet strength, gentle determination, forgiveness after a fight with a sister or a brother, because of the love of my mother. I witness the depth of her love for Dad, eternal truth in the words I do. Now I stare death in the face and know I will recover because of the love of my mother. I stand before God to give thanks for my life. Daily I pray as softly I utter, I am who I am and not any other, because of the love of my mother. All of us need people that we look to that help us through hard times. We need people who are the face of Christ within our life. My mother has certainly been that face of Christ for me in many hard times. And there have been lots of hard times within my own life. I mentioned that my dad struggled when he faced cancer, and I faced serious depression throughout my own life. My first bout with cancer came when I entered the seminary, actually, when I was an undergraduate at the University of Detroit. I lost my energy, I became depressed. It felt like there was this dark cloud that was over me. I'd never experienced anything like that before. I talked to my spiritual director about it, and he suggested that I talk to a counselor. I had never talked to a counselor before. So I went to him and I described what was going on, and he said, yeah, Michael, it sounds to me like you're depressed. I think you and I should set up a series of meetings and we'll talk about this. Well, nobody in my family had ever been depressed before, and the only category I had was that I was mentally ill, and I was telling myself I'm mentally ill. And I was so filled with pride and I was so embarrassed that I decided, well, I'm not going to go back to that counselor. He doesn't know what he's talking about. I'll just pray harder. I'll fast more. I'll read more. I'll study harder, and somehow I'll be able to get out of it. But it didn't work. In fact, what I developed were addictions, a serious addiction in my life that threatened my vocation, and my depression just became worse. Finally, it became so bad that I didn't have any choice. I knew I had to go to a counselor and face this depression and the addiction that was threatening my vocation and robbing me of any joy in life. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are we when we can be humble enough to acknowledge our need for others, that none of us can do it by ourselves, that we need the help of friends, we need the help of families, we need the help of doctors, we need the help of the community of saints to help us keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. I also had to start going to 12-step meetings. And at those 12-step meetings, I learned that we need to trust God one day at a time. Because if we just think of the future, it can become overwhelming. But if we face the struggles in our lives and we acknowledge our own weakness, that's when God can help us. I went to this counselor, and as I faced my addiction, I realized that I needed to take time off of ministry. And so I went to a facility that helps priests and brothers and religious to face our inner demons. And in the midst of that, it was a life-changing experience. Because prior to that, I had volunteered to go over to the missions. I was going to go over to Africa, and I was going to preach to the poor people over there. Well, suddenly I realized that I was among those poor people, that I needed to embrace my own poverty, my own brokenness. I needed to face the demons that were ravaging my own soul. And in the midst of facing those demons, That's when I began to truly become free. In the midst of that, I wrote a poem that was the most honest poem I had ever written in my life. See, prior to that time, I had told everybody that I was trusting God. But the reality was something else was going on. I trusted God to a point. I wasn't allowing Jesus to pick me up like one of those little lambs and to hold me close to his heart and to calm my quivering spirit. For the first time in my life, where I was trying to get the help that I needed, as I recognized my own brokenness, I allowed Jesus to pick me up and to pray from a place of radical honesty, of radical vulnerability. I wrote this poem that I want to share with you now. It's entitled Trust. It's prefaced with a quote from the Psalms, Psalm 118. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in humans. It is better to trust in the Lord than to trust in princes. Trust. I've read books on trust. I've heard tapes on trust. I've listened to sermons on trust. I've written journals on trust. But let's begin by my admitting, God, I don't trust you. I'd like to trust you. I prayed to trust you. I told others to trust you. I told others I trust you. But the truth is closer to fear. I'm afraid. I'm afraid of you. Yes, you, all-knowing, all-powerful, all-hopefully merciful God. Yes, me, semi-controlled, semi-consistent, semi-confused, me. I'm afraid of what will happen if I ever truly entrust myself into your all-powerful, almighty, all-hopefully merciful hands. You see, I've heard stories about your saints, waiting dark nights in the cell of their souls, fed to the lions for lunch, or dressed up for dinner, roasted medium rare. And I've talked to your son, and he assures me, no messenger is greater than the one who sent him. So I trust you'll lead me to a lonely hill where 3 nails and 2 wooden crossbeams are waiting. And to tell you the truth, I can't trust you'll return 3 days later to roll that stone away. I've been abandoned and betrayed already, thank you. The most trust I can muster is to entrust you my life 5 minutes at a time. Come, take me as your own. I am your servant, your child, your friend. Transform me into whatever you would have me become. I am yours for the next 5 minutes. Then please come. Please take me again as your own. Re-extend the invitation. Writing that poem was a change point in my life. It was a stepping stone. It was a significant step along my journey of my acknowledging that I'm not yet the man I want to be, that my life, like all of our lives, is a journey. There's one final image I want to suggest, and it comes from Mark chapter 8. Jesus cured many people who were blind. But in Mark chapter 8, and it's the only place in the scriptures where this story is told, there's a blind man that comes up to Jesus, and Jesus takes spit and rubs the spit in the man's eyes, an incredibly intimate image, that spit that would hold some of his spirit, and he puts it on the man's eyes, and then he says, "What do you see?" And the man looks around and he says, I see people, but they look like trees. And then Jesus lays his hands on the man's hands a second time, and he could see clearly. Those are the stepping stones. Conversion for us doesn't take place in a flash. It's not like we're sinners and then we're saints. We walk along this journey of life, step by step, allowing the Lord to transform us into the people He wants us to be. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who are humble enough. Blessed are we when we acknowledge our sin, our need for God, and we allow the Lord to take us and form us into His own. Amen. Amen.
I'm very happy to introduce Shalom World, a new Catholic, family-oriented Catholic TV that will be 24/7 English-speaking television channel. I hope that through this media we will be able to continue to spread the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ to the world, a world that needs Shalom, that needs the peace that comes from the King of Peace, Jesus Christ. I congratulate all those who participate in supporting this new media, and that it may continue to reach millions and millions of people all over the world where we need the light of Christ.
Shalom World, God's own channel.